choices that we make today, the sacrifices that we make in this moment will have a direct impact on the future that we create for those who desperately need hope. We need to be asking ourselves this question: what is it that we're doing today that people will be talking about hundreds of years from now? What choices are we making right now, here at this moment, that will actually have a lasting impact on Castle Rock? The question is this: will God need to raise up someone else to do what he's called us to do? Are we gonna do all that we can to create the future God has invited us to create? God isn't done. His heart is to continue to write new stories. The story he's writing starts now. People right here in our valley need to know that there's a God who's for them. They need to know his church is here to love them. This is our time. Next is now. Now, if you know me, you maybe have heard this story before, but I want to share it with you today because it so appropriately fits with where we're going. 21 years ago, Beth and I really sensed the deep kind of direction from the Lord that we were to come to Castle Rock and start a church. But I didn't know anything about starting churches. And so I signed up to go, or I heard about a conference that was taking place for church planters in Ocala, Florida. And I decided that that would be a great opportunity for me to learn some more. And except I didn't have the resources to go. So I called the church just to see if there was any chance that they would have had an opportunity to scholarship somebody that felt like this was where they were supposed to be. And long story short, they ended up getting me at the last minute a scholarship to be part of this church planting conference. And it was absolutely incredible. Things were going really good. I was the only guy, though, with a handwritten name tag. Have you ever been that person? Like everybody else has the sweet one. Mine's handwritten. And so anyway, we got started, and the presenters were amazing. And we were heading towards our first break. And they said, if you had a question, you just need to stand up and share your name and tell where you feel like the Lord's calling you to start a church. And then you could ask your question. There was probably 300 people or so in the room. And so I stood up and I had a question. And I said, Doug Miller, Castle Rock, Colorado. And asked my question, and they answered the question. A couple more people asked questions, and then we were getting ready to go to a break, and a gentleman ran to me. And he said, hey, are you Doug that just stood up? And I was like, yeah, I am. And he said, Castle Rock, Colorado? I was like, yeah. And I looked at his name tag. I don't remember his name, but it also said Castle Rock, Colorado. And I was like thinking in my mind, bro, that's my town. I didn't know much about church planting at the time, right? We need more than one church in town for sure. But he said, do you know what you're doing? I was like, no, for real, that's why I'm here. I do not know what I'm doing. He said, well, you better learn a lot. He said, I've been in Castle Rock for 3 years, and we've been working really hard to get a church started. And over the course of 3 years, we have 25 people that have said, that have opted in and are part of the church. And he got really serious. And he said, I am so frustrated that I don't even know what to do. He said, so a couple of months back, I invited the professor that was in charge of church planting from the seminary that I went to, Dallas Theological Seminary, to come and help me kind of do an assessment of Castle Rock. He said, so he came and we spent a couple of days just talking about the city and doing some research on the town and all the things. And he said, this is what my professor told me, that Castle Rock is actually a graveyard for church planters. And two things happened in that moment. I was like, are you kidding me? First of all, like, this seminary professor knows way more than I do about starting churches. And I have to tell you, I was completely devastated. At the same time, I started feeling a lot of frustration, because I couldn't imagine why God would call me to go to a place that was known as the graveyard for church planters. And I'm embarrassed to tell you this, I actually left the conference because I was so frustrated. Inside, there was so much turmoil going on, and so the only hotel that I could afford was this really crappy hotel. And I went back to my hotel room, and I started to pray. And the things that I was saying to God, I wish I had a recording of it because I was very frustrated. And clearly that's not the end of the story. But I'll tell you the rest of the story later. Let me first tell you where we are as a church. We've been talking about this for the past several weeks. When Beth and I moved to Castle Rock in 2006, Castle Rock had about 32,000 people. Today, we're nearly 90,000. Projections say we're headed towards 130,000 and likely more. And you know how that feels when you're downtown looking for a parking spot, right? Or trying to get into a restaurant. You feel it, I feel it. We also feel it here at church. The auditorium, look, it's full. The auditorium is full. Kids and students are bursting at the seams. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kids every week are coming to Plum Creek. In the atrium, we're shoulder to shoulder. And you know, as we're coming in and leaving our service times in the parking lots, it's really tight. God is bringing people to us, and we have a decision to make. The first decision could be this. We could decide that we would just coast as a church and just keep doing business as normal. But there's something inside of me, and I know you too, that is problematic when people pull into the parking lot and head right back out because they can't find a spot. Or when people come to the services and can't find a spot to sit, so they go ahead and leave. And I'm not the kind of person that really likes to coast. For 20 years, our church has never coasted. When we opened on August 13th, 2006, which, by the way, this August will celebrate our 20th anniversary, and we've done our best to champion Jesus in this community and to make a difference in this valley. And we've partnered with missions efforts all over the world, giving multiplied millions of dollars away. And we bought this old bowling alley and we turned it into a church. And we continue to step into faith moments that don't always make sense. And as I said in week 1 of this series, now we have another leg of the race to run. And I love what Pastor Eric has been calling this season, because I believe it's a reflection too of our hearts as it relates to just being good stewards of what God has given us. And so he's calling this mission that we're on to further our impact in Castle Rock, Operation Use Every Square Inch. And so our plans are to expand the auditorium by 40%, to expand the atrium, to reconfigure our kids' spaces, to add parking, and then create some new office space. And here's what I need you to hear me say: not because your pastor loves buildings. That is not what this is about. I love people. And I want people to know Jesus, just like you do. So let me be the first to show you where we are headed right now. We just got these earlier this week, and so you're the first, or I guess the third crew that gets to see it. This is the 3D rendering of what we're going to be doing. You can see the expanded atrium there that's going to move out to the curb cuts that you see now. Kind of up above, our plan is, Lord willing, if resources are available, to put a mezzanine in the atrium as well. And then as we start to move here to the south and the east, you can see this will be the new portion of the building that will house our staff and some additional rooms for us to use. This is what the reconfigured atrium will look like after the walls are pushed back. We're going to move where you would get coffee in the mornings when you come. And you can kind of see a little bit of the mezzanine there. Now we're in the auditorium, and we're kind of in the very back, what will be the new back, because this wall will go all the way to the external wall and create some stadium seating, which you'll see as we spin around here in just a second. I also want you to see where those doors are. The doors to the auditorium we will walk in from the same height as the top of the stairs. So we'll come in, and then we'll have that additional seating there. It's pretty exciting, isn't it? Pretty cool. It's exciting, but also I can tell you it's stretching. It's stretching. Next is now one vision, one church, and one fund. What do I mean by one fund? We're working together to just make this as simple as possible. So over the next 2 years, we're going to wrap all of this financial need into one fund. We've been sharing this over the last several weeks, 3 main areas. First of all is our operational expenses. It's about $5.25 million a year for us to do what God has called us to do here. And we've been doing that together as a church. So we need $10.5 million over the next 2 years in operational expenses. We've also made a commitment to give $3 million to missions, which over the next 2 years would be very, very close to $1 million more than we typically do in that same time frame. And then additionally, we need $12 million for this expansion project. And you've heard us say every week, our first goal is 100% participation, not equal giving, but equal obedience. And I'm excited to tell you we have 100 commitments already in. Isn't that awesome? So our staff, our elders, our board, we're all in. Contributors are starting to get in. And I need to share something with you. I can feel a little overwhelmed about all of this. And here's why. I'm a pastor. Like all of this stuff, like I had no paradigm of what would be required of us in this season. I'm not a developer. I'm not a contractor. I'm actually not a fundraiser. I'm a pastor. I love people. I like to teach the Bible. And that's why we need to be in together. But let me tell you what I do know for sure. My God has been faithful from the beginning of Plum Creek. And I can stand up here with great confidence and tell you today that that same God will be faithful as we move into Next is Now. Now, how do I know that? Because I've experienced it, but also this book that I love and I teach tells us that that is true. And we've been anchoring this series in the book of Hebrews, and I want to remind you today what we've been learning about this idea and the definition of faith. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, it says this: faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It is the evidence of things we cannot see. Faith is not certainty. Listen, faith is movement. Faith is movement, stepping into what you cannot fully see. That's how this church has always lived. That's how Beth and I have always operated. And this is what I've learned in the past 20 years. There is nothing that my God cannot do. Nothing. And maybe someone was here today, either in this room or worshiping with us online, that needed to be reminded of that, because you need to hear that in your life too. There is nothing that God cannot do. You see, it's unmistakable that God is on the move at Plum Creek. And that means we're not going to shrink back. We're not going to retreat, nor will we be intimidated by what God is calling us to do. We are advancing, and here's why. Jesus is the builder of the church. When we step forward into faith, this is not a gamble. Rather, we're aligning ourselves with the one who promised that his church will advance. So it's interesting, in Hebrews chapter 11, after we learn of this definition of faith, then the Hebrew writer begins to unpack some stories from the Old Testament where people exemplified this understanding of what faith looks like. Many will call this, Bible scholars and theologians, the Hall of Faith. Instead of the Hall of Fame, it's the Hall of Faith. In verse 32 of Hebrews chapter 11, the Hebrew writer says this: how much more do I need to say about faith? He said it would take too long to recount the stories. And then he names one of these Old Testament characters. He said it would take too long to recount the stories of faith of Gideon. Now you read that in the Hall of Faith and you're like, oh, Gideon, he must have been some kind of legit stud of faith, right? And he was. But let me explain to you the rest of the story. Gideon makes the Hall of Faith not because he was flawless and not because he felt like he was qualified. But he's in this chapter, the Hall of Faith, because he moved when God called on him. And I love that Hebrews chapter 11 is not full of stories of perfection. Rather, it's a hall of response. And here's my main thought today. Don't miss the moment. Don't miss the moment. See, the story of Gideon feels so perfect for where we are right now as a church. So if you have your Bibles, I invite you to turn to Judges chapter 6. And I'm just going to scratch the surface today, and I'm going to pick up the story again next week to kind of bring conclusion to our series. In Judges chapter 6, starting in chapter 1, it gives us the context of Gideon's story. It says this: the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight, so the Lord handed them over to the Midianites for 7 years. Say 7. You guys aren't with me today. Say 7. Okay, there we go. The Midianites were so cruel that the Israelites made hiding places for themselves in the mountains, the caves, and the strongholds. For 7 years, what the Midianites did was they waited until the crops had come up, and then they would sweep in like locusts, strip the land bare. They would steal the livestock and leave nothing behind. They did it every year. And the Midianites didn't just steal crops. When we read the story of how the nation of Israel is described in this season, what they really stole was the courage of the Israelites. In Judges chapter 6, verse 6, so Israel was reduced to starvation by the Midianites. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help. Now look at verse 11. Then the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the great tree at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash of the clan of Abiezer. Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of a winepress to hide the grain from the Midianites. Any of you have seasonal allergies? I want you to just think about what's going on here. He didn't have a mask to wear or Zyrtec, but he's literally hiding from the Midianites because he's fearful that they're going to come and take the very thing that would be the sustenance that they needed to eat because they were starving. So he's down inside of this hole in the ground that was used before for a wine press, and he's throwing the wheat up, and the chaff is kind of falling, and it's kind of going to be like a disaster for somebody with asthma. Because he wants to save what's needed to grind and make flour so that they can eat. Look at verse 12. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, "Mighty hero, the Lord is with you." That's my favorite verse in the story of Gideon, because it doesn't look like a mighty hero, right? I can imagine Gideon's down there doing his thing, and this angel of the Lord comes and says, "Mighty hero," and he's like looking around. First of all, because he's probably afraid it's a Midianite. He's like, "Don't sneak up on me like that, angel. And by the way, what's this mighty hero thing you're talking about?" And we need to slow down for just a second, because sometimes I believe we sanitize and we supersize Bible characters. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32, where Gideon's faith is honored, we forget the reality of his story. The Midianites have been brutal to the Israelites year after year after year after year. I could keep going, because how many years was it? 7. There we go. And this is the world that Gideon is living in. Mighty hero, the Lord is with you. Look at verse 14. Then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go with the strength that you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I'm sending you." Can you imagine? Just stop for a second. Imagine what's just been said. I've just been called a hero, and now he's calling on what he called a hero, but I don't think is a hero, to go and fight the Midianites who've been taking over this whole thing. They're feared. And he said some of the same things that we would say. Look at verse 15. "But Lord," Gideon replied, "how can I rescue Israel?" Here he goes. "My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I am the least in my entire family." Basically what he's saying is, "Angel, you're wrong. I don't have the pedigree, and I am nobody." Gideon doesn't respond with rebellion. He just responds with rationalization, the same way Doug did in the story I was telling you before, and the same way all too often we all do. Why me? Why now? I'm not enough. And we could be doing this right now in this next is now season. God, not me. God, not now. I can't be part of this. The timing is horrible. When Hebrews 11 lists Gideon in the hall of faith, it's not celebrating his confidence. It's celebrating his yes. And that's different. It's celebrating his yes to move forward into what God was calling him to do. And we need to understand this story as God's calling us to be part of some things too. You see, God didn't choose Gideon because he was self-confident. We just read it. I'm not the guy. God chose Gideon because he knew what Gideon would become when he obeyed. And church, that changes everything. And this is part of the reason why this season is exciting to me. Because we have an opportunity to lean into what God is calling us to. And for some of us, I'm so excited to see what God will do in our lives. The Lord clears up this challenge. Do you guys know the Lord is the same yesterday, today, and forever? That's a promise we've heard, right? Is the same God from the Old Testament the same God in the New Testament? Yep. Same God from the New Testament, the same God today? We should all be saying yes, amen, cheering and thanking God for that. Verse 16, the Lord said this, never forget it, "I will be with you, and you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man." God's promise of his presence is the same yesterday, today, and forever. It's true in our life right now too, so let's just say it out loud. Moving into a season like next is now can stir some fear, and I'm right there with you. Big vision stretches us. Faith commitments, they stretch us. Trusting God with more than feels comfortable stretches us. But when we feel that stretch, the question underneath is usually, God, what if I can't do this? But the promise that God gave Gideon wasn't, you're strong enough, bro. That wasn't it. He didn't say, listen, Gideon, you need to have a change of mind. Listen to a different soundtrack. You have everything that you can do on your own to make this happen. Rather, the promise God gave Gideon was this: I will be with you. The battle is mine, not yours. And that changes everything. That's the promise that has been given to you and I as well, because he's with us. This has never been about our capacity to do something. It's in his presence and his power. And we've talked about this before, and we're going to keep talking about this. One of the most important things that you and I can learn to do is to hear the voice of God. To learn to hear his voice, to discern the voice of God. Someday we'll write one of our follow guides on discerning and hearing the voice of God. And that's exactly where we are as well, because Gideon was in a place where he needed to hear God's voice too. Look at verse 17. Gideon replied, if you're truly going to help me, show me a sign to prove that it is really the Lord speaking to me. And some of you know the story of Gideon. If you don't, go back and read these chapters, starting in Judges chapter 6. If you're going to help me, if this is really you, God, show me a sign so I know. And that's exactly what Next to Now is all about. Hearing God's voice is vital for you and me. And we're standing where Gideon stood. We believe that God is calling us to something bigger, and God is calling each of us. And oftentimes, each of us is saying, Lord, if you're truly going to help me, show me what you want me to do. Speak, lead, confirm, and reveal my part. God didn't get a detailed spreadsheet. He got a clear next step and the promise of God's presence. In the same way, we're asking God to speak to every heart in this room, different numbers, different sacrifices, but the same faith. I love last week when Pastor Eric was telling us some of the story of he and his wife Chrissy's experience as they praying over a campaign like this one, and he had his number and Chrissy had her number and Eric went with his number, and then God changed Eric's number and Chrissy said, told you so. So this is how my wife Beth and I have done this. When we first got these printed, I took 2 of these home, and Beth had one in the spot where she spends time with Jesus, and I had one in my spot where I spend time in the morning with the Lord. And we made a commitment that we would pray individually about this and really seek the Lord's face and try and hear his voice, and that we would pray together as a couple about this specific kind of question that we were trying to discern. And then after a couple of weeks of praying those things about those things together, we would come back and we would talk about it. And so that time came, and Beth said, you go first. And I told her, and she's like, okay. The Lord gave me a different number. And I said, okay. And it was 20% more than what I had said. So the moral of the story is this: women, have big faith, please. Have big faith. And I believe that God's going to do big things. And we need to hear his voice. We need to do what he's calling us to do. So let's go, ladies. Here's the tension. If we are going to trust that he is with us, then we can't keep trusting other things to carry us. We've got to get some things out of the way. And that was exactly what happened in Gideon's life too. You've got to see this. Look at verse 25. That night, the Lord said to Gideon, take the second bull from your father's herd, the one that's 7 years old. You think God's not a God of details? You think he's not a God of numbers? He knew how old that bull was. Pull down your father's altar to Baal, that was a false god, and cut down the Asherah pole standing beside it, was also a false god in a place where they worshiped this other god besides the God that you and I serve. Look at verse 26. Then build an altar to the Lord your God here on this hilltop sanctuary, laying the stones carefully. Sacrifice the bull as a burnt offering on the altar, using as fuel the wood of the Asherah pole you cut down. Isn't that awesome? He's saying, listen, there's some things that need to get cleaned up. Before Gideon could move forward, he had to tear something down. God didn't start with the enemy, the Midianites. He started with altars and idols that were in his family's lives, just like he needs to do for you and me. I love that when he says, cut that pole down. You need to go back and read the story, by the way, because Gideon sneaks in with a buddy at night and cuts it down because he's afraid. And sometimes it's hard to cut down our idols. He started with altars and idols in Gideon's life, And that's huge for all of us. You see, before a public victory, there had to be a private realignment of allegiance to God. And that's what moments like this look like. The external enemy was the Midianites. The internal enemy was divided worship. And can I tell you, that happens in my life too. So we need to seek the Lord's face and ask him, what are the things that have kind of snuck their way to the throne in our lives? In this next is now season, we're believing God for big things. And when I think about this, it's not about a growing building, but friends, it's about impact. And even more than that, it's about future generations. It's about generations that will never know my name, but will come to a place where they have the opportunity, just like you and I do, to learn of the love of God. Just stop for a second and think about the place you were at when you gave your heart to Jesus. Perhaps a ministry that you went to where you were discipled and learned about things of faith. Someone sacrificed for those things to be a reality in your life, and we need to do that for others as well. We don't have altars like Baal or Asherah poles, at least I sure hope we don't. But there are quiet things that we lean on, control that we don't want to surrender, comfort we don't want to disrupt, and security that we don't want threatened. Perhaps even the resources that make us feel safe. Anything that sits on the throne of your heart instead of Jesus is an altar or an idol. Pastor and author Tim Keller, in his book Counterfeit Gods, put it this way: we think that idols are bad things, but that is almost never the case. The heart takes good things like a successful career, love, material possessions, even family, and turns them into ultimate things. We want the Midianites to be defeated, and God says before we can take one step towards that, we have to deal with some things in our own backyard. Gideon's first battle wasn't against the Midianites, it was against the idol in his own home. And sometimes that's true for you and me as well. But here's the hope. God didn't expose the idol to shame him. He exposed the idol to free him. That's what that was about. Because once Baal came down, the Spirit came down, and freedom precedes power. And maybe the breakthrough that you and I are praying for is waiting on the obedience that we've been postponing. So, let me take you back to that conference all those years ago, where this dude dropped on me that Castle Rock is the graveyard for church planters. I was very well aware that a seminary professor knew a lot more than I did about communities and church planting. So I found myself back at my very crappy hotel, and my emotion was very real. I was discouraged. I was overwhelmed. I was confused. I just needed to hear from God. I prayed for almost 2 hours straight that afternoon, crying out to God in the middle of my frustration, in the middle of my uncertainty, and in the middle of my lack of clarity. You know why? Because there was fear. But something happened towards the end of that prayer time in my soul. You see, what became very clear to me is that God was calling Beth and I and our family to come to Castle Rock. The hard part is this: Dougie doesn't like to fail. And this is where I had to get that afternoon. Okay. If you're calling me to go to the graveyard of church planters and we're going to fail, it's going to be we're going to fail. Because I'm not going if you're not going. And what happened while I was laying on the floor of that hotel room is that I began to develop a great sense of God's direction and confirmation in my soul that it was Castle Rock that we were supposed to come to. And I went back to the conference, but I came home from that conference with a passionate desire to do what God was calling me to do, regardless of whether or not we would succeed or fail. And friends, I can tell you that was the most important thing that happened while I was gone at that conference. And God has been faithful. And let me tell you what I know today with great certainty God is bigger than a seminary church planting prose commentary on this great valley that you and I live in. God has been on the move at Plum Creek Church ever since. God is still on the move at Plum Creek Church. And there's no way that I would tell you this has been easy, been the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. If you would have told Beth and I all of the things that we would have to endure and walk through and lead through, I would have tapped out and said, I can't do it. But friends, look at what we would have missed. And I can promise you, you need to hear me say this. I can promise you, this is not a Dougie thing. This is a God thing. Nobody's this good. And you know what? If I would have said no, I guarantee you God still would have established his church in Castle Rock. But I wouldn't have had a chance to be part of it, because that's what he does. I stand before you today proclaiming the truth that Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, where he said this, I will build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it. And I promise you that that is true today because I've experienced it. All the defenses of hell are not strong enough to stop what God wants to do through his church. So all I'm asking you to do is this. As you leave today, they're going to make sure you have a card. And will you just make a commitment to make a commitment? Just pray and ask God to speak to you and listen to his voice and do what he says. This is what we're all doing together. This isn't pressure. Please hear me. This is not pressure. This is an invitation. An invitation to posture our hearts once again and say, God, what are you inviting me into? God, I want to passionately desire, I do desire to be part of what you're doing. Tell me what you want me to do. Next weekend is what we're calling Commitment Weekend. And listen, there's nothing better than being part of what God is doing. God is on the move. Next is now. So we're going to stand to our feet. 120 people baptized this weekend. And remember, you can too. It's not too late. If you want, you go move right now, and they'll meet you in the hallway out there. And what we're going to do, this is part of Plum Creek's plan. We've done this forever. We're going to worship together. We got the double tanks. We're calling it double barrel today because there's so many folks getting baptized. And when they come up out of that water, what do? We cheer, man. We cheer. Because it's the greatest symbol of a life that says, I go public with my faith in my Jesus. Friends, listen. God is on the move at Plum Creek, and it's a joy to get to be part of it. Will you bow your heads? Father, thank you for these moments that we have in worship to you. We ask that you would be honored by our hearts as we worship. But Lord, would you help us as well, that your heart would be honored in the way that we celebrate the lives that have been changed? Will you bring back to our memories today when we made the decision to get baptized? Will you bring back the memories today of the places that other people sacrificed for us to be able to grow in our faith in? And Lord, will you stir in our hearts, begin to speak to us even today, that we would hear what you're calling us to as Plum Creek runs into the future that you've called us to experience and to know. That God, this church would continue to make a significant difference in this valley and Lord, literally all over the world. And all God's people said, amen.